afternoon, and welcome back to another episode of Breaking the Lens of Bias. My name is Kat Killian, and I am the host and the face of Breaking the Lens of Bias. I'm really glad to be back here today. I got whatever nastiness was going around again, and I'm feeling much better. So, thank you for all your words of concern and care. I do appreciate it. But I'm really glad to be back here today. And I've got kind of an interesting topic today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ohio train derailment disaster, but I'm going to put it in a context first. Um, I've been thinking a lot, and I read an article recently about it was specifically about religious education and how many people are turned off by being taught in terms of religion, but I think it's applicable to anything else about what to think. And I'm thinking back to when I was in school and how I was often taught what to think. So this is the way we do a math problem. This is what how the steps in which you need to do it. And oftentimes, I personally rebelled against that, um, because I often thought on a in a different way to solve that problem. And it was very frustrating for me when I had to show the work in that way. And I thought, well, that's stupid to do these extra steps, because if you just do it this way, you get the same answer and it's less work. And kind of one of my personal mottos as of late is work smart, not hard, if you can. There's nothing wrong with working hard, but if there's some way that you can work smarter and get more done or get it done more quickly with the same results, why wouldn't you do that? Um, so so I always kind of thought that way, and even later on when I was tutoring people in math, um, and they were very frustrated because they didn't understand the thought process that was being taught. They were said, do it this way. And I was able to take that as I was tutoring people and explain things in a different way so that they can understand. Um, and so for me, when you're taught what to think, be it in math, be it in religion, be it in other points of views in anything, when you are taught what to think, you have an idea, and it doesn't leave any opening for thinking about the idea or for questioning the idea. One of the problem in many religions today is people are leaving those faiths because they're being taught what to believe, and they're not left an opening to ask questions, and to have doubts and to have other ideas. And so it leaves this question when you are taught what to think, is I have no agency, I have my opinion doesn't matter, my thoughts don't matter, my why doesn't matter. When you teach people how to think, though, I think it's very different. So, for example, for a lot of kids get frustrated with math. Why do I need to know this? And when kids learn the why of the math, and how it's useful, and sometimes they'll understand an explanation as to why, but other kids need to see it in action. How is this going to help me? So, for example, let's say somebody loves to cook, or bake, even more important with baking. The importance of the math that's involved in that. With baking in particular, the ingredients and the proportions of the ingredients are very important in order for the recipe to come out okay. And then once kids learn that, then they can learn what to adjust and what to do that, to make it more interesting, to make it more of them. And I can think of that in art, in learning photography, I learned there was a lot of math to it, and there was a reason for that math. And once you understood those mathematical principles that are important in photography, you understood what it meant and how to use it effectively in order to create something um, of beauty and of substance. So I'm thinking. So here's just some things that I threw out that I could think of how you can engage children in mathematics, and how to get them to think about it and why it's important. Um, when it comes to bigger questions of the world, like, why am I here? Why do I exist? And you know, about philosophical questions. That's basically it. So you have these philosophical questions, and if you just teach people what to think, in order to be a good person, you need to do this, and you need to believe this, and you need to say this, and if you do this, you follow the rules, and that's it. But there's always nuances. There's always things. I mean, one thing regarding like purity culture, um, don't have sex before marriage, kind of thing. And then, what happens when children or adolescents are confronted with those feelings? How do they deal with them? If it's just a simple answer, don't do it, well, what does that lead? And what happens when, things happen? And so they're confronted with that. And then how does that make them feel? Well, I was told not to do it. I'm a bad person, all that kind of stuff. And getting into this whole thing, rather than say, why were you why were you taught this? Why do we believe this? Why do we believe that it's important? And then when you have those questions, well, I have this feeling. What do I want to do about it? How do you address that? And I'm not saying I agree with purity culture or anything like that. I'm just using that as an example of how being taught what to think closes you off. Being taught how to think and being given the afforded the opportunity to ask questions and to say things, um, and to explore what those mean and what those consequences are. Because as an older adult, I know oftentimes what the consequences are for certain actions. Um, Young people don't. And so it's very easy for us to tell them, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to think, this is how you need to believe, and you'll be okay. When their sensory, their thoughts, their sensory perception of the world is different, and they're being taught or shown things that contradict that, they're going to have these natural questions. And so if we teach them how to think about it, what is the next question? Well, what will happen uh, if I give in to my sexual urges? What are the consequences that could happen? And they might not know that if they're just taught don't do it. um, but if they're taught the consequences, that might give them pause. I'm not guaranteeing it for sure, but other things like, um, use of alcohol and drugs, and what that can lead to, what those consequences are. um, Again, we have laws in place, which is why, people under the age of 21, um, it is illegal for them to consume alcohol. It happens quite frequently. um, Oftentimes they'll get older people, but still in their peer range, that might purchase them. They might take it from their parents. They might do that. But if they understand the consequences of that, rather than just a don't do it, that might have different kinds of things. So going back to school and in children's thoughts, if you ever observe young children, and I'm quite fortunate to have a number of younger children um, in my life that I sometimes get to interact with, and see how they think and see the things that they do, and the curiosity and the expression of how they think of things is just is fascinating. because I would think never to think of something that way or to think of doing that, because I have this certain body of knowledge and understanding, and it's very easy for me to just say, well, don't do that. Um, and for me, I always try to give them a why. You know, and would request that they not do that for various reasons. One kid was just laying on the floor, and he thought it was kind of fun to put his footprints on the wall. And I was like, okay, I could see why it could be interesting. His shoes were muddy and they were, putting footprints on the wall, and thought they were making art. And I suppose in a way it was. But the consequences of that was that one of the adults were going to have to come in and clean up that wall. And so maybe wasn't the best idea in the world. Um, and get them to understand that why, but to understand that mind of the child and to appreciate that, leads into that whole idea of, well, how can we take that young mind and that natural curiosity and the natural instincts, and mold it so that it's channeled in a direction that doesn't have those kinds of consequences, as simple as an adult having to clean the wall, or something more serious. um, and so, we don't do that. By the time the kids get to school, even younger and younger, I mean, I remember in kindergarten was mostly a playtime. There was some learning going on, but it was all playful learning. um, and nowadays these kids are in kindergarten, and sometimes even their first exposure to school is they're working on academics, and they're forced to sit in chairs for longer periods of time without playing, in shorter recess periods, and getting into line. And it's more about discipline and what to think. So, and in that process, the natural curiosity is stifled. um so, in thinking about this, I'm thinking is, and maybe this is a whole new educational model or something like that, but even as we move on through the grades, you know, instead of telling people what to think and how to do things and how to arrive at, is give them a problem, give them guidance, give them boundaries, but give them the framework in which to figure out the problem themselves. Going back to a cooking example, I'm thinking is that I've I've made mistakes in cooking. I've misread recipes, and something comes out and I'm like, oh, it's horrible. And other times I'm like, wow, this has a really strong flavor of, say, garlic. And I'm like, wow, that really adds something to it. And then I kind of realize, oh, no wonder it's so garlicky, because instead of a teaspoon, I added a tablespoon, for example. And so that's different. Um, One time in baking, I used baking powder instead of baking soda, or the vice versa. I forget. It's been a while. And uh, the cake came out. It didn't taste bad. It just came out super fluffy and over the sides of the pan. And I was like, oh, once I figured out why it happened and what I did wrong, I could do that. And that, so I could have berated myself for beating, doing it wrong. What did I do wrong? Instead of figuring out what I did wrong and seeing why, and then tasting it and still saying, well, it didn't taste bad. Um, it was what it was. It was that ability to improvise, to make mistakes, to create something different, that allowed me to do that. Live streaming for me has been a process. If you've watched my show over times, you've seen how it's evolved, how I've been able to change things and do things, and it's still a process. I'm still learning, and that's kind of the point, is that I'm allowing that natural curiosity, that natural questioning of how do things work, not it works this way and this is the formula you must use. Because there are a lot of YouTube videos on that. So I know I'm getting a little bit, I said I promised I was going to get to the Ohio train derailment disaster and talk to you know taught about that. So right now, we're hearing the adults, and we're I'm seeing so much commentary on it, and it's not being thought of critically. And so I'm looking at this disaster. I'm saying, what happened? Okay, so we know what happened. The train derailed. It spilled these toxic chemicals. They had to do these various activities in terms in burning it off in order to try to mitigate the disaster based on their experience of these chemicals and what would happen if it did that. So now the question is the question that isn't being asked enough that needs to be asked is why did it happen? Um, and so we can get the immediate whys of the mechanical failures of the different things that are happening. So we're hearing about brakes, we're hearing about um, train being too long and too heavy. We're hearing things about there not being enough enough crew members on the train, um, and so this is where the NTSB gets involved and they look at it and they say, what exactly happened here? And they're going to look at all these different factors and they're going to figure that out. And that's not an easy answer. Okay? Once we have that answer of why it happened in terms of uh, the physical nature, these are the causes of this disaster. Then we have to ask another why. Why was that? Why were those failures that caused this disaster allowed to happen? What led up to it happening? What was done? And there's some of that going on right now. There's talk about deregulation. Where did it happen? Under whose administration? Because the politicians are looking for blame, as many of us are, because we're a highly politicized society and we're often going to fall into that camp. And is that going to get us anywhere? I mean, therein lies the thing. Where is it going to get us? If your goal is to blame and place blame and deflect from any blame that you yourself might have, or the political parties that you believe in that may have had a hand in this, or the company that may have had a hand in this, you're going to take that position. But if we have nothing to gain from that, and most of us don't, unfortunately, those poor people who live in East Palestine, Ohio, have a lot riding on this and what that means for them. Um, the important thing is if something happens like this and we say it's a disaster, what is the point of going in after the fact and saying, well, what this happened, well, let's clean it up, which is all great and wonderful, and that needs to happen after we have disasters. But the larger question is, what can we learn from this? Just as I learned from the cake, or I learned from the too much garlic. What went wrong, and how can I correct that in the future? So it's asking those questions, and sometimes we have to drill down on the why. Well, okay, if deregulation was part of it, well, why did we deregulate? What were the reasons for that? Where did it come from? Why did why did we want that deregulation if that happened? And so getting to that point and saying, okay, now we know where the root is. And now we can say, let's look at that root and let's fix that root cause of the problem. And then perhaps this won't happen anymore. I remember this happening at work. Um, we had things at work that had to be done in a certain order, and there were double checks built into the system. I know this because I built the system. And what would happen inevitably is someone would say, the person who came before me, it's their responsibility to do it right. And that was true. But it was that second person's responsibility to check behind the first person. Because if it didn't get right, done right, it would create problems on down the road inevitably. And so part of um, that second process was double checking what the first person did, and then the third person in the process would, or the third step in the process would be double check the first and the second person. And when everybody said, "Well, I'm going to rely on everybody else to do their job," which means I'm not doing mine because if mine is double check, it's to double check. Um, then when the problem happens, then it would always fall back on my desk, and I would have to figure out and solve the problem and spend an inordinate amount of time to fix it. When if everyone is doing what their part is in that system, if you know the why do we do it this way in the first place? Why do we check? Why do we double check? Um, then it should go smoothly. But mistakes will happen. It is inevitable. We're human beings and we are all fallible, and that would be a mistake. But the important thing is to think of the why and have that critical thinking process of figuring it out so that we could solve the problems rather than just assess blame. Oftentimes with biased thinking or faulty thinking or just being told what to do and I'm following what I was told to do, um, you will inevitably have problems that come up because you're not taught the how to think. You're not taught to say, well, why do you do this? I always appreciated in working when people would ask that why. Why do we do this? We do it this way because. And I needed to have that answer. And so I look at this in life as I need to have that answer. Why did something happen wrong? Or why is something going smoothly? Um, and then looking into the problem and trying to solve it. But we can only do that through critical thinking. Biased thinking leads to blame. Critical thinking leads to solutions. So I think that's basically the message for today. It was a little bit different and a little bit roundabout, but I do indeed hope that you found this useful, and I do hope that you tune in again. And again, as always, there is please feel free if you have any issues that you'd like me to look at, any specific biases that you'd like me to talk about, and ways to combat those biases. Please feel free to put it in the chat. I do read the chat and respond, and I'd love to do that. And also, too, if anybody wants to be a guest on the show and we can talk uh, about biases and how to break them, I'd be glad to have you as a guest. So anyway, again, my name's Kat Killian. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Bye.